and that is that the walls of Fort Frederick are the only, we talked about it, are the only man-made structure that actually was made by
The slave.
it was made by the shells that were left from Native Americans
Mm-hmm.
eating the oysters, and they took that and they
Mm-hmm.
built the
Mm-hmm.
walls of it in 1720s.
Mm-hmm.
But then it was abandoned and stood there until 1862, when that where it stood became Camp Saxton.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Emancipation Proclamation happened, they used those walls as a kind of a wharf. So they put boards over it, and the steamboats would bring people up the day of the Emancipation Proclamation. They bring people up there, and they would walk over those walls into the Smith Plantation to Camp Saxton is what it became. They were mustering in the first South Carolina. Prince Rivers was there, Brisbane was there, all of them. So they walked across this. Well, that's all that's left of that. And as far as we know, it's the only celebration in the South where that happened on that day. They did actually, Lincoln didn't sign it till later in the day, but they were doing that. They were celebrating by 10 o'clock or noon.
What day was it? January 1st?
That's
what I thought.
They had the huge celebration that Higginson and
Mansfield French, as I remember.
French, and Brisbane read the initial, the preliminary, because they didn't have it.
And that's where he saw the one enslaved person that he could not find. He spent his fortune, he spent everything to find these people and free them. And I think Brisbane's a fascinating case because he started out as a pro-slavery writer and theorist. And as he began to debate with those abolitionists from the North, arguing that slavery was not Christian, he changes his mind. So I think that's another good example of a good flip-flopper.
Oh, gosh, I love that too. Sorry, I probably stepped on that line. But what I was going to say, my nose is itching like crazy.
I do that sometimes too.
It's hard if you're
yeah.
by the camera. But how important do you think that it is for something like that is a real monument, to be accessible to people?
Well, I think this is a great example because this is not just black and white, but it's multicultural. I mean, the shells were built, or the walls were built from shells, or at least covered with shells that Native Americans who were here before either Europeans or African Americans had built there. And then, of course, African Americans were there as well and used this place. And then they all come across it. I think it's a wonderful metaphor for what our multicultural America is. And we need to commemorate things like the Emancipation Proclamation. And remember, no walls came falling down, no chains fell off that day, but the central meaning of America was changed. People knew that this war was no longer just a war about preserving the Union, which is what Lincoln had said it was at first and continued until that time. But now it was also a war against slavery and for freedom and liberty. And it changed the meaning of, in fact, liberty itself in the United States and the world. The war did, and the amendments that came out of it. And it really begins with this Emancipation Proclamation, this legal document ending slavery. And one of the things that people sort of forget about the Emancipation Proclamation, it sort of sanctions slave rebellion. And, of course, it calls for the use of African American men to fight in this war. That is, to take up arms against their former owners and the Confederates. And soon, with African American troops, as South Carolinians and other white Southerners known a long time, African Americans were willing to shed the blood of their oppressors as well as their own lives for freedom.
Well, that is. Did that cover what you wanted to ask?
Well, yeah, but just one thought I had.
We haven't done much on South Carolina.
And I want to go back to that Brisbane story again, too, just to make sure that that's a clear, concise little story. But what must it have it been? What was it like in your imagination for these 8,000 contrabands gathered in this one place for the first time to actually hear something that was not just in the wind as hearsay, but something coming off a document from Washington that was official?
Yeah.
I mean, that to me, I get chills just thinking about what it must have been like to hear those words, even if they were in the back of the crowd and couldn't hear that it was happening.
Well, are you ready?
Yes.
Well, we say that Lincoln freed the slaves, but the historians have pointed out it was not just Lincoln. Every time the Union forces got close, even you can quote Southern newspapers, African Americans were heading off to freedom. They were freeing themselves, and that's exactly what happened here at Port Royal. The African American enslaved people were murdered because they would not go off with their owners. They did everything to try to get them to leave with them, to go in the upcountry, get away from the invasion of the Union Army, but they would not. I would even say that Robert E. Lee helped free the slaves in the sense that he was such a good general. He made the war drag out long enough for Lincoln to be able to get the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure across time. But I think you have to put yourself in this setting. African Americans had been running away to the Army, they'd been running away since they had been enslaved, but certainly during the Civil War. And every time they ran away, of course, that took away from resources from the Confederacy, both people to work in the field and supply them, but also the number of people that had to manage them to keep them from running away. But I think you've got to imagine for the first time they are hearing a document from the President of the United States. I think this is when, for African Americans, Lincoln comes from being the president to Father Abraham. Here's an official document saying that they are ending slavery. This war is now a war to end slavery. He had given the Confederacy fair warning. They had months to come back into the Union, preserve slavery. Now they weren't. The war is now an official war to end slavery. And it changes. It changes everything. And for African Americans, I think, who had been enslaved, to hear that the official policy of the United States government was to end slavery had to be a moment that's just extraordinary. Just amazing, if you can imagine. Men and women who had asserted their own freedom, who had defined their own freedom by being unmastered and doing the things that they had a choice to, getting up when they wanted to, eating when they wanted to, the little things, but now an official document that says that they will be free.